This review is brought to you on a view screen because, holograms. They're just shit, aren't they?
Something has us locked in a place.
Like a fly in a web.
Get down!
My people have a condition. It is terminal. Death is inevitable.
You are my family. After everything that we have been through, we are not going to let you die.
Hello, I'm Phil. Welcome to my channel where I talk about all sorts of geeky pop culture stuff like Doctor Who and books and Star Trek. I talk about Star Trek as well, like this video right here where I'm going to be doing another one of my weekly reviews of new Star Trek Discovery. We're on like the 4th episode of the 2nd season now, aren't we? I think. Yeah, 4th episode. And it's called An Obol for Cheron. Cheron. Cheron? Sounds French. I think it's actually something to do with Greek mythology. But sounds French. 2 episodes ago, we had New Eden, which I said at the time in my review was a really good blend of the 2 styles of Trek. The Discovery's own sort of very more serialized storytelling style with the more classic Trek single contained adventure where it has a beginning, a middle and an end. And it did that really, really well. Then unfortunately last week it kind of slipped back a bit into the really heavy serialized element, and there wasn't really in the structure of last week's episode a beginning, a middle and an end to the story. This week we're back to what I think is the best formula for Discovery going forward, which is that nice blend of the 2. It does it in a slightly different way to New Eden, but what we've got are plots where there is a beginning, a middle and an end. There are 3 plots going on at the same time, like there were last week. They do tie into the overarching plot arc elements, like they did last week, but this time they're tied together nicely. They each have their own separate beginning, middle and end, with possibly the exception of one, but even that, I'd argue, even the Tilly storyline, which I'll come to in a minute, even though it kind of has a cliffhanger element to it, it does also kind of feel like it has a beginning, a middle and end as well. So all of that meant that I think it tied together in a much neater way than last week's episode, and I'd argue even possibly better than the New Eden episode. This was, of course, Saru's episode, and what a performance. I've loved Saru throughout the whole of Discovery. I think he's a really interesting and good character, and he's played brilliantly by Doug Jones, and I'm really glad he got something with some real punch to it this episode, because some emotional heft to it, because it worked really well, and the payoff was really good. There were some really nice moments throughout with his whole illness storyline. From the way he played it in that initial briefing, where it was treating it like a common cold, right through to some really good emotional moments. That moment where he's taken off the bridge by Burnham at the end, and he thinks he's going to die, and the whole bridge crew all stand in silence. They all rise from their seated positions and stand to sort of honour him as he goes out. That was a really touching moment. And then that scene with Burnham at the end where he thinks he's going to die and she thinks he's going to die, it was very, very touching, and I think really well done and really well acted, especially by Doug Jones, but also by Burnham as well. She did a good job. I forget the actress's name now, but she did a good job in that scene as well. It was a really powerful storyline, and I think done really well. It was also really nice to see Saru taking a forefront in the episode, not just in the sense that he was one of the plots, that he was ill and he was dying, and there was that whole what was going on there element, but also he was at the forefront in solving a lot of the solutions, a lot of the problems for the episode as well. The whole universal translator virus, which I think, by the way, was a great scene. When they all started speaking different languages, the comedy in that was brilliant, and it got a chance for Saru to show off. I think this episode blends comedy and the more serious elements of the plotline really well. That scene was very funny, but it led into scenes with Saru which were much more emotional, and they blended really well. It didn't seem like an artificial sort of like, okay, we're stopping the human out and going on to the serious stuff, it was a nice, easy transition between the two, which worked. And yeah, he got to solve that problem, which was a nice change, because a lot of the time, and I know this will certainly appease, I hope, some of the people that have been criticising Burnham as a sort of Mary Sue character, the one that solves all the problems. We got a lot of different people solving different problems in this episode. A lot of the bridge crew helped out. You know, you had the people in engineering solving their own problems. Even when Burnham turned up, it was very much the focus was on them. And I think that's really important in moving into a more ensemble feel for this show, because I think and I said this in a previous review, the focus on one single character on a show like Star Trek, it was a brave decision, and I think it might have worked, but I think ultimately Star Trek works best when it's an ensemble show. So you need to get everybody having their moments at some point, and everybody solving the dilemma at some point, them being the ones. It can't be the same person every time. So it was really nice to see Saru take that role in this episode. Now, the one element of his plot that I was a bit more iffy on is right at the end, and it was just a more of a kind of, it didn't quite ring true moment where, and that was how, I don't want to say easy, but how quick it seemed that Burnham was willing to just accept that, okay, he's going to die, because he says he's going to die. He says this is what happens on his planet, and that's it, and she's going to believe him. She's a scientist. Now, she knows he comes from a very, very superstitious, well, very, from the Federation's point of view, primitive planet. Primitive species that live in huts and generally have a very, old-fashioned traditional way of life. Now, if I was her and if I was a scientist, my first thought would be, okay, you've assumed your culture tells you, and all your histories tell you, that this is what happens when you get this thing, and that you always die or you always go off and be culled by your predators. But you didn't have the advantage of the medical science that the Federation has, and I don't know. I would assume that as a scientist, she would want to probe that more before jumping straight to willing to consider euthanasia, which she does quite quickly, I think. So that's the only one real problem I have with that. I think it was quite interesting that they were going to go, teetered on the edge of going down that euthanasia route, and I'm quite glad they didn't. But just because, I love Saru, obviously I don't want him to die, but also I just think that's a big issue, and Star Trek absolutely should cover big issues, but not in like such a small space of time, because effectively he asked her to euthanize him, and within, I don't know, a few minutes the plot had been solved and he wasn't going to die. So that's not enough time to dedicate to that. So if you're going to really bring up something like that, it needs to be in a whole episode. There needs to be time to let the ideas brew, and that this didn't have that. So I'm glad that they, in the end, didn't really go too far down that route. The fact that Burnham was seemingly willing to is interesting, but I'm glad they didn't explore it further in such a short space of time. I think that's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. What is interesting is what the new status quo for Saru means. That's an element that's clearly going to play into future storylines. We know there's an episode coming up that's set on Saru's planet. He now knows that there's, I suppose, a stage past being the prey, and clearly the prey people on their planet that have been preying on their Saru species all these years, the Kelpians, they maybe knew about the fact that they might, if they were left long enough, and that's why they cull them, because because the thing is, once they get that illness, they're then sent off to be culled. Now, if you as the prey species knew what happens after they have it, and know that if the ganglia falls off, they become more confident, strong, they might uprise against you and become more of a threat to you, then you would do, then they would do everything in their power to keep them down by organising this culling. So it's very interesting, and I'm sure we will see that some consequence of this coming up in the episode where we go to his planet. There's the whole General Order 1 to consider. There's clearly going to be a conflict there between what Saru wants to do and General Order 1. It's going to be very interesting to see where that goes, I think. This episode did a bit more tidying up of the continuity as well, so that's always appreciated. We had a bit of stuff about the uniforms last time. This time, the holograms. Where then they're nowhere to be seen in the original series or the Next Generation. They only come about again in Deep Space Nine. So why is that? Well, we got some hints here. Something went wrong with the Enterprise. The holographic systems were apparently a part of that in some way. So maybe they have a vulnerability that is exploited by the Red Angel species, possibly Iconians, in some fashion, and maybe that's why eventually the technology is stripped out of all Starfleet ships. It's only a hint at the moment, but it goes a little way to explain that. I mean, it would have been better if they just not had it in the first place, of course, but what can you do? At least they're trying to fix it. And of course, one of the other big continuity things is the spore drive. You know, could hop instantly around the galaxy. Why is this technology not seen in any future iterations of Star Trek? Why is it not seen? Why are people not hopping around the universe? Well, we got a hint of why that might be, because evidently there are living creatures, the spore creature that has taken over Tilly, in that mycelial network, and Discovery's hopping around has seemingly damaged their ecosystem. So if that's the case, certainly with the morals of the Federation, they would not want to damage the ecosystem of a whole civilization. So it's starting to lead towards, I think, how they're going to end up abandoning the spore drive technology. Now, other species wouldn't probably not be so worried about that. So the Klingons, for instance, probably wouldn't care so much about the spore species within the mycelial network. So there's still the element of how many Klingons know about it. Well, we know some of them do, because some of them have been on the ship when it happens. Some of them were posing as Starfleet members. You know, why have they not developed the technology? There's, you know, only a handful of people. It's understandable that they might not, but hey, look, this is another thing that's going towards that, so that's quite nice. After a very rocky start, the Tilly storyline with the spore, the first episode where she had the imaginary friend, I wasn't keen on that episode and her part of that episode, but it's actually, every episode it improves a little bit, and I'm really liking some of the more dramatic stuff we're getting from Tilly now. I you know, her silliness and slightly quirkiness sometimes annoys me, but I really like it when it's played for more in more tense situations rather than just for offhand comedy. And here it worked really well. I think the whole dynamic. We got the engineer that they found on that ship in the first episode. She was back in this episode, and I kind of like her. She's quite sassy and you know, not willing to take any shit from anybody really. So I like her, and her banter with Stamets was fun to watch. And then the whole spore thing is interesting, and I'm intrigued to see where it goes. I think the next episode is probably mostly set in the mycelial network, so what we might get some more closure on the spore drive in that episode. It's going to be a hunt for Tilly, I assume, because she's now disappeared, presumably into the spore network. The spores have plans, or that spore has plans for Tilly. It's all quite exciting, and I'm intrigued to see where it goes. The sphere was a very good central sort of problem for the episode, very much in a sort of TNG style classic Trek episode. You know, I'm thinking like Encounter at Farpoint, where they just come across this big floating thing, and you know, what does it do, and is it a threat, and how are they going to survive it? They can't move away, that kind of thing. It kind of felt very much in that sort of vibe, and I think it worked really well. It was beautifully realised. I think it looked great on screen. It was a plot device that could go, you know, maybe we'll find out where it's come from, maybe we won't. But if we don't, I think there was enough there that it fulfilled its purpose. It presented a possible threat, and in the end it provided them with information and instigated loads of other plot lines along the way, and it was interesting. I think that was well realised. This episode does have 3 different plot lines running at the same time, which last week, as I said, was a bit of a negative, with 3 plot lines that were running concurrently, and but they felt very separate last week. Here, although they start off very separate, they kind of all come together at the end, and they're all much better linked and tied together. And partly that's on a very practical level, that all the storylines do kind of converge at the end. They all take place on the ship, so that probably helps. But also thematically, they have a lot in common as well. There's one big theme, I'd say, running through this episode, and that's of empathy. The empathy towards the spore creature and its plight. Stamets talking about empathy for what kind of fuel they use generally, and that he talks about Earth's past. Empathy for the people that created the sphere thing, or the sphere thing itself, if it happens to be sentient, and the fact that it wants to pass on knowledge. And of course Burnham's empathy towards Saru at the end there, when she's considering fulfilling his request. So all of those tied in quite nicely. One other thing I didn't say about Burnham and Saru is that I love the way their relationship has developed, because if you remember, at the very start of the series, they were quite adversarial to each other. You know, they butted heads quite a lot. And in a way, they had a brother and sister relationship back then as well, but it was very much brother and sisters in conflict. You know, they were always trying to better each other. Here, you see the sort of more love side of that, and the affection they have for one another, and how important they are for one another. And I think that's gradually grown over the series, and I think the respect they have for each other has gradually grown over the series. So it's really nice to see that in this episode and pay off that. So yeah, I think this was a good episode of Discovery. I think more like this, more where they combine the serialized storytelling nature with a contained plot element, so that you get a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end each episode, but you also get the continuing plot threads and some of the cliffhangers, like Tilly disappearing and things like that. I think that blend has working really well for the couple of episodes we've had it, and I think they need to continue doing more like that. So let's keep our fingers crossed for that. Thank you very much for watching. Do check out my previous reviews of the other episodes if you haven't already, and do subscribe if you want to see more Star Trek reviews from me, along with loads of other geeky content. I'll do a lot of Doctor Who content if you like that too. So thank you very much, and I will see you hopefully next week. Goodbye.